My name is John Hennessy, and I am delighted to welcome you today to the first of two Tanner lectures on human values that will be given this year by Andrew Bacevich. Andrew is a military historian, a retired U.S. Army colonel, and professor of history and international relations at Boston University. We are pleased to be able to offer the Tanner lectures at Stanford. They were established by one of our former colleagues, Obert Clark Tanner, in 1978 in the hope that they would contribute to the intellectual and moral life of mankind. The Tanner Lecture Series gives us an opportunity to invite distinguished, recognized speakers to campus to discuss issues of great importance to the human condition. We, in addition to 8 other universities around the country, offer these lectures. I'm especially looking forward to Professor Bacevich's comments today. But before introducing him, I want to take a moment to recognize the people who helped organize this year's lectures, members of the program in Ethics and Society, the Tanner Lectures Steering Committee, and a number of staff from Building 10. Thank them for all their hard work putting this together. Now let's turn to today's lecturer. Andrew Bacevich is the son of 2 World War II veterans. His father served in the Coast Guard and his mother in the Army Nurse Corps. He credits his parents' service to their country for helping to shape his worldview. After growing up in the Midwest, he wanted to go east for college and enrolled in the U.S. Military Academy. After West Point, he served in Vietnam, Germany, and the 1990s in the Persian Gulf, as well as a number of posts inside the United States. In the mid-1970s, he earned his master's and doctorate degrees in American diplomatic history from Princeton University, after which he taught history at West Point. He taught Johns Hopkins in the mid-1990s before joining the faculty at Boston University in 1998, where he has served as director of the Center for International Relations for 7 years. Currently, he is Professor Emeritus of History and International Relations at Boston University. A distinguished military historian, Dr. Bacevich is a prolific writer as well. His writings have been widely published in both scholarly and general interest journals, including the Wilson Quarterly, the National Interest, Foreign Affairs, the New Republic, and The Nation. And his opinion pieces have appeared in newspapers such as the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and Los Angeles Times, and that's the short list. Some of his recent books include Breach of Trust, How Americans Failed Their Soldiers and Their Country, 2013, Washington Rules, America's Path to Permanent War, 2010, and Limits of Power, The End of American Exceptionalism, 2008. He has critically examined America's foreign policy from World War II to the present day, and among his recurring points are the difficulty we have in ending wars and the unintended and often long-ranging consequences of moving to the voluntary military force in the 1970s. In a 2010 interview with Bill Moyers, he talked about the U.S., and I quote, deficit of self-awareness. He said, Americans tend to see the history of the 20th century as a triumphal narrative. It is not an interpretation that I would agree with, he said, but as a consequence of that interpretation of the 20th century, Americans have come to believe deeply that the answers to the world's ills are found here. And despite the fact that we confront failures like Vietnam and like Iraq, we cling to this notion that we possess history's secrets. Gary Bass, professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton, wrote in a New York Times review of Professor Bacevich's book, Washington Rules, Bacevich sees himself as upholding a tradition from George Washington and John Quincy Adams to J. William Fulbright and Martin Luther King Jr. That tradition calls on America to exemplify freedom, but not actively spread it. It is with great pleasure that I look forward to these Tanner lectures in which Professor Bacevich will examine America's war for the greater Middle East. Today's lecture is focused on the origins and conduct, Tomorrow at 10 a.m., he will join Joe Felter, Senior Research Scholar at CSAC and Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and Tamara Wittes, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution, for further discussion of this topic. The second Tanner lecture will be held tomorrow at the same time, in the same place, when the focus will be on consequences. And Friday morning at 10 a.m., he will join Greg Jones, foreign correspondent and investigative journalist, and David Luban, university professor in law and philosophy at Georgetown, in a discussion seminar. Both of the discussion seminars will be held upstairs in the Oxenberg seminar room. And now, please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Bacevich to Stanford University.
Well, I thank President Hennessy for that immensely generous introduction. I'm certainly grateful. He's right. It takes a lot of hard work and good people to put together an event like this, and flying folks in from all over the country, and it's just it's quite a wonderful event. My wife and I appreciate the hospitality that we've been shown by everybody. Now, basically, what you're going to get over the next 2 days is kind of a Cliff Notes version of a book that I have coming out on April 4th. And there's a danger here in doing this, because I'm going to tell you what the book is all about, and then you may say, well, I got it, so why would I bother to actually go out and fork over whatever it's going to be, $25 and buy one? But I want to assure you that there are many important insights and passages that I am leaving out. So if you want to get the full effect, you're going to have to buy the book. Let me hop into it. For well over 30 years now, the United States military has been intensively engaged in various quarters of the Islamic world. And an end to that involvement is nowhere in sight. Tick off the countries in that region that U.S. forces in recent decades have invaded, occupied, garrisoned, bombed, or raided, and where American soldiers have killed or been killed. Since 1980, they include Iraq and Afghanistan, of course, but also Iran, Lebanon, Libya, Turkey, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Bosnia, Kosovo, Yemen, Sudan, Somalia, Pakistan, and Syria. The list just keeps getting longer. To judge by various official explanations coming out of Washington, the mission of the troops dispatched to these various quarters has been to defend or deter or liberate, punishing the wicked and protecting the innocent, while spreading liberal values and generally keeping Americans safe. What are we to make of the larger enterprise in which the United States has been engaged for well over 3 decades? What is the nature of the military struggle that we are waging? What should we call it? Well, for several years after 9/11, Americans referred to it as the global war on terrorism, an ill-chosen term that has since fallen out of favor. For a brief period during the early years of the George W. Bush administration, certain neoconservatives promoted the term World War IV. In this construct, the Cold War had been World War III. But this never caught on. In part, I think, because unlike other major 20th century conflicts, this one found the American people sitting on the sidelines. With interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan dragging on inconclusively, some military officers in the middle of the last decade began referring to what they called the Long War, while nicely capturing the temporal dimension of the conflict. This label had nothing to say about purpose, adversary, or location. As with World War IV, the Long War never gained much traction. Well, here's another possibility. Since 1980, back when President Jimmy Carter promulgated the Carter Doctrine, the United States has been engaged in what we should rightfully call America's war for the greater Middle East. The premise that underlies this war can be simply stated: with disorder, dysfunction, and disarray posing a growing threat to vital U.S. national security interests, the adroit application of hard power ought to check those tendencies and thereby foster conditions conducive to U.S. interests. That's the idea. Choose whatever term you like: police, pacify, shape, control, dominate, transform. In 1980, President Carter launched the United States in a project aimed at nothing less than determining the fate and future of the peoples inhabiting the Ark of Nations from West Africa and the Maghreb all the way across the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf to Central Asia. Since the end of World War II, American soldiers had fought and died in Asia. And even when the wars in Korea and Vietnam ended, U.S. troop contingents continued to garrison that region. In Europe, a major U.S. military presence dating from the beginning of the Cold War signaled Washington's willingness to fight there as well. But prior to Carter's watershed 1980 statement, no comparable commitment toward the Islamic world existed. And now that was going to change. Only in retrospect does this become clear, of course. At the time when President Carter declared the Persian Gulf a vital U.S. national security interest, that's the literal meaning of the Carter Doctrine, he, Carter, certainly did not intend to embark upon a war. Nor did he, Carter, anticipate what course that war was going to follow, its duration, costs, and consequences. Like the European statesman who just over 100 years ago touched off the cataclysm that we know today as World War I, Carter merely lit a fuse without knowing where it led. Carter and his advisors were largely clueless as to what lay inside the Pandora's box that they insisted upon opening. But what they and their successors in government found there prompted them to initiate a sequence of military actions, some large, some small, that deserve collective recognition as a war. Now, as an American, let me state plainly my own assessment of that war. We have not won it. We are not winning it, and simply pressing on is unlikely to produce more positive results next year or the year after. Regarding America's war for the greater Middle East, we can say only one thing with certainty: it will not end anytime soon. It has become self-perpetuating. Now, questions raised by this undertaking will preoccupy and perhaps confound scholars for decades to come. In my remarks this evening and again tomorrow, I will limit myself to four of the most fundamental questions. First, what motivated the United States to act as it has? Second, what have civilians responsible for formulating policy and soldiers charged with implementing policy sought to accomplish? Third, regardless of their intentions, what actually ensued? And fourth, with what consequences? In short, taken together, these two lectures will link aims to actions to outcomes. Now, the United States embarked upon its war for the greater Middle East in order to preserve the American way of life. But the United States embarked upon its war for the greater Middle East to assure its access to Persian Gulf oil. Both of those statements are true. Back in 1980, the American way of life required bountiful supplies of cheap oil. Even today, whether for good or for ill, that remains the case. But back in 1980, unlike today, the approaching depletion of once plentiful North American oil reserves appeared to be an irreversible fact. The implications of that apparent fact, driven home to the American consumer by successive oil shocks in the 1970s, had vaulted the Persian Gulf into the first tier of U.S. geopolitical interests. So just as the American Civil War was about slavery, America's war for the Greater Middle East from the outset has been about oil. Of course, slavery alone does not define all that divided North and South. At stake was not simply whether people of color should be held in bondage, but which political, economic, and social arrangements were to shape the American future. Similarly, even from the outset, oil alone does not explain what drew the United States militarily into the Greater Middle East. At stake was something much more than the commodity that had lubricated the American way of life. At stake were the expectations of limitlessness that many Americans had taken to be part of their birthright. During the 1960s and 1970s, the United States had seemingly run headlong into limits. In Vietnam, it encountered a war that it could not win. At home, seemingly in the matter of a few short years, the golden age of post-war posterity sputtered to an end, leaving Americans to confront low growth, high inflation, and industrial decline. The oil shocks were the icing on an unwelcome and unpalatable cake. So the war for the Greater Middle East was one expression of a collective determination to push back against these signs of beleaguerment, to affirm the singularity of the United States as a nation not bound by the constraints that others were obliged to respect. In September 2001, as this conflict that I'm describing was entering its third decade, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld took it upon himself to make explicit the rationale for war that until that moment had been largely implicit. Speaking with characteristic crispness at a Pentagon press conference, Rumsfeld explained why the United States had opted for war. "We have a choice," he said, "either to change the way we live, which is unacceptable, or to change the way they live, and we chose the latter." The American way of life is sacrosanct, so most Americans believe. And just as prior victories, most notably in 1865 and 1945, had enabled Americans to create that way of life, so too victory in the war for the Greater Middle East would enable them to preserve that way of life. Now, back in the summer of 1979, President Jimmy Carter had toyed with the other possibility. He had invited Americans, acting on their own volition, to modify their way of life, accepting limits, and thereby obviating the need to fight for its preservation. In a nationally televised address, subsequently enshrined as his Malaise speech, Carter proposed a trade. Shed those aspects of the American way of life that, in his view at least, were false or extraneous, retain and indeed elevate those aspects of the American way of life that, again, in his view, qualified as true and good. In a nation that was proud of hard work, strong families, close-knit communities, and our faith in God, Carter declared, too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but by what one owns. But we've discovered, the president continued, We've discovered that owning things and consuming things does not satisfy our longing for meaning. We've learned that piling up material goods cannot fill the emptiness of lives which have no confidence or purpose. We are at a turning point in our history, the president continued. There are two paths to choose. One is a path that leads to fragmentation and self-interest. Down that road lies a mistaken idea of freedom, the right to grasp for ourselves some advantage over others. That path would be one of constant conflict between narrow interests ending in chaos and immobility. It is a certain route to failure, he warned. All the traditions of our past, all the lessons of our heritage, all the promises of our future point to another path, the path of common purpose and the restoration of American values. That path leads to true freedom for our nation and ourselves. And then came the punchline, the president said. We can take the first steps down that path as we begin to solve our energy problem. The energy crisis, Carter had persuaded himself, was actually an opportunity. Ending their addiction to oil would enable Americans to rediscover and reclaim authentic freedom. At least in the interim, of course, that implied sacrifice and getting by with less. Although couching his appeal in non-sectarian language, Carter was calling for a new Great Awakening, which, like its predecessors, promised to purge and purify and renew. And if Americans heeded their pastor, they would cease to worship the golden calf and return to the true religion. Well, Americans weren't buying, of course. They weren't about to settle for less. They wanted more. A reality that Carter himself soon accepted. Yet as we prepare to examine the road taken in 1980 and followed ever since, it's worth recalling that the United States might have chosen differently. Well, just 6 months later, Carter himself capitulated. Partly for domestic political reasons. Remember that 1980 was a presidential election year. Partly to counter perceptions that America itself was flagging. Remember that the Soviets had just invaded Afghanistan and the Iran hostage crisis was a continuing embarrassment. 6 months later, Carter threw in with the proponents of more, using the occasion of his January 1980 State of the Union address to add the Persian Gulf to the list of places that the United States considered worth fighting for. And the full-fledged militarization of U.S. policy in the greater Middle East, overt and covert, direct and through intermediaries, commenced forthwith. Although himself a minor player in that ensuing drama, Carter remained on stage long enough in order to order the first shots in what was to become a very long struggle. This was Operation Eagle Claw, which began and ended on the night of April 24, 25, 1980, unraveling even before participating U.S. troops had engaged the enemy, the equivalent of a football team succumbing to defeat even before taking the field. Eagle Claw combined modesty of purpose with audacity of design. As America's war for the greater Middle East evolved over the next several decades, a succession of presidents described U.S. objectives in expansive terms. Yet participants in the abortive campaign that initiated that war set out to do none of these things. They sought merely to rescue. The previous November, a group of young Iranian radicals had seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and taken several dozen Americans hostage. Now, with diplomacy having failed to produce a resolution, a frustrated Carter ordered America's warriors to give it a try. The plan, developed by U.S. military officers and ultimately approved by the President himself, was as daring as the 1942 Doolittle raid, and several times more intricate. Imagine if instead of bombing Tokyo, Jimmy Doolittle had tried to abscond with the Imperial Art Collection. Now, whether that plan could possibly have succeeded is a moot point. It never got past phase one. Bad luck intervened, its impact magnified by human foibles and frailties. It all ended at a desert rendezvous point when a Marine CH-53 helicopter collided with the U.S. Air Force C-130 transport. 8 Americans died in the resulting inferno, and the survivors hastily departed the scene, abandoning their equipment, documents, classified gear, and the remains of their comrades. On the morning of April 25th, the somber President Carter appeared on national television to take responsibility for this ignominious failure. Yet while making a show of accepting responsibility, the President was in fact deflecting attention from questions of far larger importance. Here was obfuscation dressed up as accountability. For those who had devised, ordered, and participated in Operation Eagle Claw, the resulting humiliation was almost unbearable. Yet humiliation makes a poor teacher. The underlying premises now informing U.S. policy that the problems facing the United States in the greater Middle East would yield to a military solution, that premise not only escaped notice, but became more deeply entrenched. Jimmy Carter's successor, Ronald Reagan, who became president on January 20th, 1981, brought to office a sunny disposition and a naive, if genuine, belief in the efficacy of U.S. military power. On matters related to the Cold War, President Reagan had fixed opinions. Elsewhere, he was totally out of his depth. During Reagan's 8 years as Commander-in-Chief, U.S. involvement in the greater Middle East simultaneously escalated and became incoherent. His sole achievement of note was to create U.S. Central Command, or CENTCOM, as the principal instrument of U.S. military intervention in the region. The rest was a dog's breakfast, yielding consequences that ranged from the unintended to the unwelcome. We begin with Lebanon. In the summer of 1982, Reagan dispatched U.S. Marines on an ill-fated attempt to restore stability to Lebanon in the wake of a reckless Israeli invasion of that country. Caught in the middle of what became a civil war, the Marines lacked the capability or the mandate to make a difference. They became sitting ducks. The upshot? 241 Americans killed in a single day when a truck bomber plowed into the Marine barracks. For public consumption, the President responded by projecting a stiffly Reagan-esque upper lip. "Let no terrorist question our will," he declared, "or no tyrant doubt our resolve." Citing what he called the courage and determination that formed essential parts of the American character, Reagan emphasized, quote, that we must not and will not be intimidated by anyone anywhere. Then, after the barest interval, with the battleship New Jersey vainly blasting away offshore, he ordered the Marines to evacuate, thereby calling American resolve very much into question. Next, Libya. Muammar Gaddafi, for one, appeared less than impressed by American courage and determination. In Reagan's eyes, Gaddafi rated, this is Reagan's words, as a clown and a madman. In the spring of 1986, in an effort to eliminate or at least intimidate the Libyan dictator, the Reagan administration orchestrated a showdown by sending U.S. naval forces across a Gaddafi-designated line of death into contested territorial waters. When the Libyan forces rose to the bait, 3 U.S. carrier task forces responded. sinking a pair of Libyan gunboats and blasting a missile site without suffering any losses. The Libyans have learned something from us. Admiral William Crowe, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, crowed. I was afraid I'd blow that line. This judgment proved considerably premature. Just weeks later, a bomb detonated in a West Berlin disco frequented by GIs and killed 2 Americans while wounding dozens of others. Citing radio intercepts, the U.S. blamed Gaddafi for the attack and vowed to retaliate. The result was Operation El Dorado Canyon, an airstrike targeting Libyan military installations, one of them the barracks where Gaddafi himself maintained his principal residence. The immensely complicated operation, which involved bombers flying from bases in the United Kingdom and carriers afloat in the Med, did not go well. Of the 18 F-111 bombers involved, 6 had to abort. The 7th dropped its bombs on the French embassy, and an 8th was shot down, with both crew members killed. In barely 10 minutes, all U.S. aircraft had departed Libyan airspace, having hit a grand total of 5 targets, and of course, Gaddafi himself escaped unscathed. Even so, the Reagan administration claimed victory. According to the president, this one-and-done attack showed that, quote, there was no place on earth where terrorists can rest and train and practice their deadly skills. Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger told reporters that the raid would, quote, send an unmistakable signal. And he predicted that it would, quote, go far toward deterring future acts of terrorism. Secretary of State George Shultz wrote in his memoir that after twitching feverishly with a flurry of vengeful responses, Gaddafi himself quieted down and retreated into the desert. Again, the judgment proved premature. Less than 2 years later, the State Department admitted that, quote, there was no evidence that Libya has abandoned support of international terrorism, subversion, and aggression, and events soon affirmed the truth of that statement. In December 1988, as Reagan was preparing to leave office, a device planted by Libyan agents blew up Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing all 259 souls aboard, to include I forgot to put the number of Americans. I think it was about 111, plus 11 other people on the ground. The point is that as an exercise in behavior modification, Operation El Dorado Canyon had at best a transitory impact. Let's turn next to Afghanistan, compared to which Lebanon and Libya were small potatoes. In response to the Soviet invasion of December 1979, President Carter had initiated a modest program of covert assistance to Afghan resistance forces. President Reagan greatly expanded that program. Under Reagan, what the CIA called Operation Cyclone remained covert only in the most nominal sense, especially after Reagan hosted Mujahideen leaders for a photo op in the Oval Office. During the 1980s, U.S. support for Afghan freedom fighters increased from year to year, totaling between $4 and $5 billion in all. Most of that came in the form of weapons and munitions. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia matched the U.S. contribution dollar for dollar, while the government of Pakistan provided a base of support, even as it helped itself to a generous cut of this largesse. By 1989, having killed somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million Afghans, the exhausted Soviets finally gave up trying to pacify that country. As the last Soviet soldier departed, the CIA officer running Cyclone sent a cable back to headquarters in Langley. "We won," it read in its entirety. But again, the judgment proved sadly premature. In the context of the Cold War, Cyclone had produced a notable success. In the context of America's war for the Greater Middle East, it produced chaos. Once the Kremlin lost interest in Afghanistan, so too did Washington. Congratulating themselves on besting the Soviets, U.S. policymakers moved on to other, more important matters. Washington thought that it was done with Afghanistan, a miscalculation of monumental proportions. Finally, let's review Reagan's efforts in the Persian Gulf itself, which, after all, forms the central theater in the war for the Greater Middle East. In 1980, Iraq had launched a war of aggression against Iran. Saddam Hussein expecting a quick win. And not for the last time, Saddam miscalculated. This first Gulf War turned out to be very long and very bloody. When it appeared that Iran might actually prevail, the Reagan administration threw in with Saddam, providing Iraq with various types of intelligence and material support. Citing freedom of navigation through the Gulf as a pretext, the United States also effectively demolished a vastly outgunned Iranian navy. Triggering this remarkable episode, known as Operation Praying Mantis, was an Iraqi attack on a U.S. naval warship. In response to the Iraqi attack on the U.S. naval warship, Washington held Iran responsible for killing 37 sailors. The episode concluded when a different U.S. Navy warship shot down an Iranian commercial airliner, killing all 290 persons aboard. More remarkably still, amidst all these confused maneuverings, the Reagan administration was secretly and illegally providing weaponry to Iran using Israel as an intermediary. So in effect, a professed neutral, the United States was simultaneously supporting both sides in a conflict that claimed somewhere between 400,000 and 1 million dead by the time it ended in 1988 in a draw. What judgments can we make of America's war for the Greater Middle East during its preliminary phase? Well, by the end of the 1980s, several themes had begun to emerge. First, this war was unfolding in a strategic void, the United States committing its forces without any overarching sense of purpose. Second, the paltry scale of U.S. deployments and our preference for relying on intermediaries suggested either ambivalence or half-heartedness. And third, as a direct consequence of points 1 and 2, efforts to translate military power into conclusive political outcomes repeatedly came up short. The presidency of George H.W. Bush marked a change in tune, or so it appeared at the time. The elder Bush's single term of office included a second Gulf War, begun like the first by an act of Iraqi aggression. Yet although Washington might tolerate Saddam Hussein attacking Iran, annexing Kuwait and threatening Saudi Arabia was another matter altogether. So after the briefest hesitation, Bush announced his intention to teach Saddam a lesson. The resulting campaign, known as Operation Desert Storm, stands apart from all other actions during America's war for the Greater Middle East. Here was the sole occasion in which the United States maximized the military power assembled to perform the task at hand. The 500,000 U.S. troops that ultimately deployed to the Gulf sufficed both to outnumber and to overwhelm Saddam Hussein's hapless legions. The campaign commenced in January 1991 with 6 weeks of intensive aerial bombardment, during which Iraqi forces remained largely passive while absorbing punishing losses. And it concluded with a 100-hour-long ground campaign that was more rout than fight. Here, it appeared, was a truly historic victory, offering compelling evidence that the United States had ascended to a position of unprecedented military supremacy. But appearances deceived. Unanticipated complications arose, in considerable part due to American errors of judgment. Bush had ordered offensive operations to stop before Iraq's Republican Guard, the most capable and most loyal part of Saddam's army, had been destroyed. And as a result, Saddam Hussein retained the capability to crush the uprising of Kurds and Iraqi Shiites who, with Bush's encouragement, were seeking his overthrow. Compounding the error, the American field commander publicly indicated that U.S. forces in Iraq had no intention of staying. Indeed, were eager to depart as quickly as possible. And this they did, heading home for elaborate celebratory parades and thereby presenting Saddam with an unearned gift of breathing space. The upshot was that Saddam survived, and de facto, the Second Iraq War continued. Sufficient U.S. forces remained in the Gulf, to include Saudi Arabia, to enforce what one American general called an air occupation of Iraq. On a daily basis, U.S. combat aircraft patrolled Iraqi airspace, routinely plastering elements of Saddam's weakened air defenses while periodically bombing Baghdad to punish Saddam when he misbehaved. This low-level conflict persisted throughout the following decade. Merely by surviving, Saddam became, in Washington's eyes, a sort of Moby Dick, an obsession to which U.S. policymakers attributed undeserved importance. Some Muslims, among them a jihadist veteran by the name of Osama bin Laden, took umbrage at the continued presence of U.S. forces in the land of the two holy places. Containing Iraq thus provoked retaliation by radical Islamists in the form of attacks targeting U.S. forces in Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. Now, according to George H.W. Bush, Operation Desert Storm had freed the United States from further self-imposed restraints on the use of force. And during the 1990s, policymakers used this greater freedom of action to open up new fronts in the war for the greater Middle East. Bush himself got the ball rolling in December 1992 by intervening in Somalia. Bush's successor, Bill Clinton, inherited this operation, known as Restore Hope, which began as an effort to feed starving Muslims, became an exercise in nation building, and culminated in a nasty U.S. defeat at the hands of a warlord in command of a rabble. Clinton beat a hasty retreat, and as had Beirut a decade earlier, Somalia called American staying power into question. Clinton had better luck in the ruins of Yugoslavia. There he intervened twice on behalf of besieged Muslims, first in Bosnia and then in Kosovo. These were low-cost, air-only campaigns, followed by a protracted occupation, but not involving combat. In America's war for the greater Middle East, the Balkans rated as little more than a sideshow of no greater importance than the invasion of Grenada had been during the Cold War. Yet whatever the benefits to Bosnians and Kosovars, America's standing elsewhere in the Islamic world remained abysmal. Of greater significance during the 1990s were the first U.S. shots fired at al-Qaeda. In 1998, bin Laden had declared war on the United States. That same year, a U.S. missile attack targeting al-Qaeda in Afghanistan while simultaneously taking a swipe at Sudan implicitly acknowledged that a state of war existed. This operation was the grandly titled Operation Infinite Reach. Once again, however, the preference for one-and-done attacks all but guaranteed its ineffectiveness. The successful prosecution of war requires more than gestures. By the time Clinton handed over his office to George W. Bush in January 2001, America's war for the Greater Middle East was already showing signs of permanence. That is, the sources of instability that had drawn the United States into the region militarily showed no signs of disappearing anytime soon. What terms best describe U.S. military actions during the first 2 decades of America's war for the Greater Middle East? Frequent, but generally episodic. Reactive. Inconclusive. Devoid of overall design. Tending to induce complications rather than to provide clean solutions to perceived problems. Let's call this the war's preliminary phase. We may liken it to the phony war of 1939-1940, when Great Britain and France had declared war on Nazi Germany, but balked at confronting what such a war was going to entail. Well, the preliminaries ended with the events of September 11, 2001, which brought home the reality of war with painful and brutal clarity. Yet 9/11 did not come out of nowhere. Like the Wehrmacht's Ardennes offensive of May 1940, it actually marked the escalation of a conflict that was already underway. President George W. Bush, in command of the world's most powerful national security apparatus, had failed to anticipate, had failed to deflect this direct attack on the American homeland. For that failure, no one was held accountable. No one in a position of authority lost their job. Well, responsibility for explaining to the American people what had happened and what the state intended to do to prevent any recurrence inevitably and quite properly fell to the president himself. In a series of now iconic statements, Bush conceded that the United States found itself engaged in a very large conflict which he unhelpfully, and I think misleadingly, characterized as a global war on terrorism. Now, in the president's personal lexicon, terrorism was interchangeable with evil. So a war to destroy terrorism, as Bush vowed to do, necessarily became a war to destroy evil. As for the war's origins, Bush depicted them as ideological in character. The new war, in his view, represented a renewal of wars that in the collective American memory had defined the 20th century. And as with World War II, and as with the Cold War, freedom itself was at stake, and freedom itself was destined once more to emerge triumphant. But coming to freedom's defense was going to require wide-ranging offensive action. How specifically such a war was going to unfold was very much up for grabs. A global war on terrorism did not number among the contingencies for which the Pentagon had at hand a ready-made plan. And although the president warned Americans to expect an altogether different conflict, in his words, there would be no islands to conquer and no beachheads to storm, the president did not spell out exactly what those differences implied. Others, however, in his administration had already taken up the question. And the term they devised to describe the enterprise offers a concise expression of their intentions. Not without reason, critics of the phrase global war on terrorism have noted the absurdity of waging war against a tactic, or in Bush's preferred formulation, of waging war to eliminate evil. Yet for our purposes, the instructive element of that phrase is the administration's insistence on characterizing the war as global to undertake a global war was to remove limits on the exercise of American power. Even before 9/11, the Bush administration had chafed against any such constraints and had sought to remove them. With the passing of the Cold War, deterrence is not enough, President Bush had declared. This was in a speech at the National Defense University months before 9/11. Deterrence is not enough. So the events of 9/11, in this sense, created the opportunity to act on this perceived imperative of moving beyond deterrence. While any war of even modest scope is fought for multiple purposes, the overarching aim of Bush's global war on terrorism was to unshackle American military power. Doing so, Bush and his principal subordinates believed, held the key to preserving the American way of life and all it entailed. From the outset, in other words, the war's purposes looked beyond any immediate danger posed by al-Qaeda or even by the disordered condition of the greater Middle East. Ultimately, the war's architects were seeking to perpetuate the privileged status that most Americans assumed to be part of their birthright. Doing so meant laying down a new set of rules, expanding the prerogatives exercised by the world's sole superpower, and thereby extending the American century into perpetuity. It's in this context that we should understand Secretary Rumsfeld's stated war aim of changing the way they live. No member of the Pentagon press corps had pressed Rumsfeld to explain who they were. But the implication of Rumsfeld's diktat was clear. Any state or group or entity actively supporting, inclined to support, or sympathizing with anti-American terrorism was going to have to change its ways. Rumsfeld's first impulse after 9/11 itself was to frame the problem in the broadest possible terms. Need to move swiftly, go massive, sweep it all up, things related and not. It's a note he scribbled, one of his famous snowflakes, right after, I think it was on 9/11 itself. Without bothering to count heads, going massive implied an encounter with many millions of people in at least a couple dozen countries, most, but not all of them, in the Islamic world. Over the previous 2 decades, U.S. military involvement in those precincts had amounted to little more than dabbling. According to the Carter Doctrine, to sustain the American way of life, it was incumbent upon the United States to ensure security of the Persian Gulf and its environs. Each of the younger Bush's predecessors, going back to Carter, had accepted this proposition, as did Bush himself, yet to this point, each of these predecessors had shied away from engaging in large-scale, sustained military action. In that sense, America's war for the greater Middle East had lacked seriousness, but that phase now ended. If the war does not significantly change the world's political map, Rumsfeld wrote the president, the U.S. will not achieve its aim. Well, as a war aim, changing the way they live possessed a sort of grandeur, either noble or preposterous, depending on one's point of view. Making good on such an ambitious aim, thereby redrawing the world's political map, implied a willingness to undertake comparably large exertions. Oddly, however, the Bush administration balked at providing the wherewithal required. In terms of the stakes involved, at least described by the president and his people, the global war on terrorism might bear comparison with World War II or with the Cold War. But it was not going to resemble those earlier conflicts in terms of national commitment. Undertaking a global war did not prompt President Bush to mobilize the nation. The state would not exact new taxes or expect shared sacrifice. It would not impose conscription. everyday existence was to continue as usual. The president charging Americans, quote, to enjoy life the way we want it to be enjoyed. Now imagine Abraham Lincoln saying that during the siege of Fort Sumter. Imagine Franklin Roosevelt in a fireside chat uttering those sentiments days after Pearl Harbor. And if you imagine that, it seems to me the impossibility of imagining that speaks volumes about the Bush administration's failure to grasp the challenges that it was choosing to embrace. From the outset, in other words, between declared ends and the means available to achieve those ends, there yawned a very large gap. You know, in the days and weeks immediately after 9/11, Americans, united in righteous anger, would have done just about anything that President Bush, as commander-in-chief, had asked them to do. But apart from passive deference, he asked for next to nothing. While greatly enlarging the scope of America's war for the greater Middle East, the Bush administration did not expand the role allotted to the American people. Indeed, it minimized that role, thereby establishing a relationship between state and society destined to persist for the remainder of the war's duration. The effect was comparable to a prenuptial agreement. Once signed, difficult, if not impossible, to renegotiate, especially once the romance begins to wear thin. Two factors explain the Bush administration's decision to consign the public to the status of spectators. On the one hand, senior U.S. officials, civilian and military alike, assessed public involvement in the war as unnecessary. Properly employed, they believed, existing military capabilities would suffice to get the job done. And on the other hand, they saw public involvement as inconvenient, more likely to infringe upon their own freedom of action than to make any meaningful contribution to victory. Underpinning these views was a set of expectations about how the contest ahead was going to unfold. Put simply, the capabilities inherent in the high-tech approach to warfare, glimpsed at Desert Storm and perfected since, if properly exploited, would determine the war's outcome. According to this thinking, quality mattered more than quantity, agility and precision more than brute force. Modern war, they believed, was a business best left to professionals. In the 21st century battlefield, soldiers cut from the same cloth as the conscripts who had fought in World War II or Korea or Vietnam were likely to be a net liability. And indeed, the preliminary results achieved in the first post-9/11 military campaign seemed to affirm such expectations. That campaign initiated a new Afghanistan war, with the United States this time playing an overt rather than a covert role. The purpose of Operation Enduring Freedom was twofold. First, to destroy or at least significantly weaken al-Qaeda, and second, to make clear the fate awaiting any regime providing support or sanctuary to anti-American terrorists, as the Taliban had done. Although the president's advisors briefly toyed with the notion of going after Saddam Hussein, Afghanistan's #1 ranking on the Bush administration's hit list was never seriously in doubt. The Taliban-controlled government of Afghanistan had provided sanctuary to al-Qaeda and had rejected U.S. demands to hand over bin Laden after 9/11, and now they would pay for that refusal. The opening phase of Enduring Freedom was as audacious an operation as any undertaken in the annals of U.S. military history. It was also astonishingly successful, even if that success proved incomplete, transitory, and misleading. Briefly, a small contingent of Special Operations Forces, along with a handful of CIA paramilitaries, succeeded in putting the world's most powerful air force at the service of anti-Taliban militants who, within a matter of weeks, ousted the Taliban from power. The American general in charge surveyed the results and declared that he had, quote, destroyed an army the Soviets had failed to dislodge with more than 1 million men. Further, he said, forces under his command had, quote, liberated 25 million people and unified the country. This was balderdash, of course. Operation Enduring Freedom had dispersed, but not destroyed, the Taliban and al-Qaeda. Bin Laden himself remained at large. Nothing had been decided. And the Afghanistan war was destined to continue for many, many years to come. Nonetheless, the Bush administration chose to interpret the results as a resounding victory, and it moved on, training its sights on Saddam Hussein's Iraq, the subject to which we will turn tomorrow. Thank you very much.